Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week, I continue my series on Eclipse Phase 2nd Edition by talking about the setting itself. Last week, I talked about the history, how we got to where we are. This week, I'm going to put some of those pieces together. The setting itself for Eclipse Phase is, on the surface, fairly simple, but when you start getting into it, it's like peeling back layers on an onion. So this is going to be a very quick surface overview of the major details. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as I talk about Eclipse Phase 2nd Edition. Where does one start talking about Eclipse Phase? The same place one would start talking about any setting, with the one thing that sets it apart. That is the foundation upon which the rest of the setting is built. While I could talk about the hypercorpse and the fall, no. Those aren't truly the core of Eclipse Phase. No. Eclipse Phase revolves around a small little sphere right at the base of your skull called the Cortical Stack. What this does is this keeps track of, records everything you feel, think, do, say, all your memories, all your sensations, everything is stored in the Cortical Stack. From there, if you die and your Cortical Stack is retrievable, someone can just pull that out, pop it into a new body, you're good. If it's not retrievable, well, when was your last backup? Your last backup can be saved into a new Cortical Stack in a new body. And that's what kind of sets the setting apart. First off, death isn't permanent. Well, sorry, let me rephrase that. Is not necessarily permanent. It is possible, if someone goes through the effort to track down all your backups, it is theoretically possible to kill someone permanently, but it takes work. In fact, generally speaking, they don't consider on most habitats killing someone, killing their body as murder. Instead, it's more like grievous bodily harm, because your body is just a shell. What matters is the Cortical Stack and your backup and all your saved data of who you are. Because of this, there's this trend for there to be this thing called InfoGs. Informational refugees. These are people who escaped Earth as only data. Either they were farcast someplace, or it was just their Cortical Stack that got out. And what these InfoGs are stuck doing is menial labor. For the most part, what's going to happen is the hypercorps are going to look through the people that are stored and go, oh, this person has the skills I need for this project or projects. I'm going to give them this offer. You work for me for X number of years. I will pay you X amount of basic living expenses. And then at the end of that time, you get a body. Now, of course, they're going to company store the people. basically keep them in debt in some way or another so that when their contract is up, they're encouraged to keep working to pay off said debt. Unless they were smart and saved somehow. But for the most part, it's very much going to be someone is downloaded into either a info life where they are just a data entity doing certain things, or they're going to be downloaded into basic bodies that are just capable of doing what the hypercorp needs. And eventually these people will earn or buy off the new body that they're going to get. At the same time, you have people who are very wealthy, who have a lot of reputation or a lot of credits, and so they have multiple bodies. Maybe they have a body on each habitat they travel to regularly. Or maybe they just change bodies fairly regularly. Doesn't matter. Whatever the case is, there are people who can just afford to change bodies, to have multiple bodies just lying around. And they also have backup insurance and up-to-date backups. They might even have something on their Cortical Stack that if they die, it does an emergency forecast of all the contents of their Cortical Stack to a set location. That way there's no loss of who they are or loss of continuity between one body, one incarnation, and the next. It also has the benefit of they know that they died, because they kind of might remember it. But, again, that is sort of the detail here. Eclipse Phase is definitely about that. That is such a core theme. You can actually have missions that are about retrieving a Cortical Stack. You can start off a game, a story, with the characters waking up in the middle of being re-sleeved, or after having been re-sleeved, and getting a notification that something's happened. They have X number of hours still to stop something bad from happening. What did they do? What happened? How did they end up getting re-sleeved in the middle of this? Are they dead? Or did someone just trigger the backup from them? You don't know. You've got to investigate this. You've got to find out what happened. And that's always an interesting way to start a game. And then we start moving away from that. Remember when I mentioned you could be re-sleeved by corpse for work in exchange for a body? Well, one of the things the hypercorps do is they are working on a process of both mining and terraforming Venus. This is a long process. One of the things that they have achieved so far is making the upper levels of the atmosphere habitable. The lower levels, however, well, those are still under tremendous pressure and are still highly acidic. There are special morphs, special bodies designed for just that work. there are special bodies made for living and working on Mars. There are special bodies for sailing the sun. The body is called the Surya. It's basically a giant whale type body. And it swims through the solar corona. Yeah, that's awesome. Of course, there are other specialized bodies. There's what's called bouncers. They have hands, and they have hands for feet. They're meant for working in low and zero gravity environments. Of course, you also have the various types of morphs that are not biological. These are what are called. There's two types of these types of morphs. There are pods, which are sort of biomorphs. They're put together and assembled from parts. They're sort of Frankenstein type morphs, assembled from different parts, and there's seam lines showing where they were put together. They, like the synthmorphs, which are all mechanical, have cyber brains, which are basically computer brains, and something called puppet socks. What these are inputs that let someone remotely control that body. And these tend to be built for a lot of very specialized functions. First off, pods are cheaper than a full biomorph. Because first off, it's cheaper to do a cyber brain than a biological brain. But also, it's cheaper when you can grow a whole vat of arms, legs, kidneys, etc., and then see which work best. As opposed to having to holistically grow a whole person. But pods have some unusual features. First off, of course, is they're stitched together. Well, not stitched, but they are made from different component parts. Also, these tend to have a bit of a stigma attached to them because they're cheap. Because they're quick and easy to make. They can still do all the biological functions. People kind of find them a little bit icky to some degree. And then, of course, you have the synthmorphs. These are completely mechanical. No biological components at all. I would say androids, except androids kind of has its own little baggage with that term. Basically, they call the synthmorphs the clanking masses. These are the cheap bodies that most people get re-sleeved into. When they get going, they'll try and save up to buy a biomorph or even a pod. But for the most part, these are viewed as the low-class people, the poor people. And they have that stigma attached with them in the inner system, where the hypercorps rules supreme. The outer portions of the system, they're kind of viewed as a mixed blessing. They don't need air, they don't need food, they don't need water. They just need repairs from time to time. So they're kind of good on that. They don't suck up resources. And in fact, there are sections of stations where the clanking masses live that are pretty much open to space. And yeah, that is the rough overview of the Cortical Stack and morphs. Because now we're going to get ready to talk about the hypercorps. Imagine a world where all you need are raw materials. A world where pretty much scarcity is a thing of the past. Where all people are really doing when they're mining is they're mining for the minerals themselves. They don't need to refine them. They don't need to do any of that. They can just throw the raw rocks into a nanofabrication machine and get whatever they need. And you have a rough idea of the state of the world of Eclipse Phase. Eclipse Phase does have some form of credits in the area controlled by the hypercorps. Because, like any good corporation, they could not leave the idea of currency behind. The difference is like the rest of the solar system, the hypercorps don't really have physical assets. They don't manufacture goods per se. They are intellectual entities. What do I mean by that? I mean, a hypercorp doesn't make the body you're in, or doesn't make the gun you're wielding, or the implant you've put into your morph. They make the blueprints and then they license them out. Because anyone can nanofabricate what they need. And when you get into the world of Eclipse Phase, you quickly learn that manufacturing skills, those aren't such a big deal. What matters is creativity. And the hypercorps control the inner system. Mercury, Venus, Luna, and Mars. It is the hypercorps who maintain the quarantine zone around Earth itself. You know, this is for good reason, mind you, but it is the hypercorps that run this area. And they have done a lot. They have, as I mentioned, begun terraforming on Venus. They've gotten the upper layers of the atmosphere habitable. And floating in these upper layers of the atmosphere are what are called aerostats. These are basically floating cities. People live, work, all that on these aerostats. And the Morningstar Corporation, which actually controls them, has turned them very much into an area of prestige and fashion. It is the glitterati who truly rule Venus. And they are, of course, supported by the clanking masses under them and the less beautiful people. The people who can't afford a beautiful body. And from this location, they're continuing the work, long term, of building up and terraforming Venus. Mars had started being terraformed before the fall. After the fall, it was the Hypercorps who first off declared Mars humanity's new home, but they are also the ones who began heavily working on terraforming. Now there's actually places on Mars where you don't need respirators or anything like that. And there are specific bodies designed to function on Mars. Two, in fact, the Ruster and the Martian Alpiner. Rusters are able to go most places on Mars, especially the deep ravines, while the Alpiners are able to go into the higher altitudes on Mars without need of respirators or rebreathers or any special gear like that. But that's just a little side note there. Overall, the Hypercorps control the inner system. The outer system gets tricky, gets messy, I should say. First off, you have the Jovian Republic. This is a institution of, bioconservatives. They absolutely do not believe in even the Cortical Stack. Heck, they don't even believe in the basic gene fixes. This is the only place where you will find what are called flats. The baseline, normal, genetically flawed in all human beings. Everywhere else, bodies have at least gene fixes. But you will not find even those in the Jovian Republic. Titan is its own little special case. It is a massive autonomous collective. And it basically holds itself apart from everything else, but they also kind of maintain anyone is welcome as long as they're not gonna mess things up. And then, of course, you have all sorts of O'Neill cylinders, various habitats, all that, all throughout the outer system. There you will find various philosophies in use, whether it be people who are just trying to make the most of humanity, trying to push the limits and create the best, brightest, strongest, fastest humans you can, or whether it be a O'Neill cylinder where every single person there is an alpha fork, a full copy of the person who found the alpha cylinder, the O'Neill cylinder. And all sorts of other weird things. Traveling between all these areas are the caravans of old ships carrying needed supplies, whether it be actual medical supplies or the raw materials to make different things. And these ships, these wandering ships, are collectively called the Scum. They're the ultimate autonomous, really. They're beholden to no one except wherever they can sell their stuff and whatever they can sell it for. They're they can sort of be pirates, they can sort of be criminals, and they can be sort of free traders. They're sort of a mix of all of those. And that is a rough look at the system and how the hypercorps sort of play into everything. But one thing you have to understand is the economy is unique now. The only thing that is of value is live performances, live creation of something. Poetry, the first creation of that poem, that's when it's most valuable. Watching a dance performance, watching someone play a musical instrument, someone handcrafting something. Those are valuable because those are creative endeavors. And from there, we start getting into the world where your reputation matters. And in the outer systems, in the autonomous regions, you can get a lot based on just your reputation. Mostly because what your reputation represents is what you are willing to sacrifice to help them. Or what you have sacrificed already to help that cylinder run, or help Firewall stop existential threats. Stuff like that. And that matters to these people. So if you have a good enough rep, you can trade on your rep to get free stuff. In the inner system, under the hypercorps, you get credits, and you buy and sell with the value in credits. And I mentioned Firewall, so let's take a brief talk about them. After the fall, a group of people were like, not again. We're never going to let that happen again. How do we fight this? Let's create a secret, not affiliated with anyone else's organization. With all of the vast resources of the people we can pull together initially. And what this organization will do is it will look for and neutralize existential threats to humanity before they become an issue. This means Firewall might target someone who's working on artificial superintelligences again. Or maybe it will target a research lab that's dealing with something that could unleash a gray goo disaster. Or maybe it will go after someone who has memories of something. You might have to go into the quarantine zone around Earth, into one of the many ships there that have died over the years, or during the fall itself, to get the cortical stack of somebody who has important information. And that's the only time that they had it, and had it available. And that's what Firewall does. It's sort of outside of every group, but working to protect them all. Of course, there's always the fun existential threats that you can't really predict because they can also be helpful. What am I talking about? Psychics. One thing that the Titans did before they vanished was they released something called the Excercise Virus. And the Excercise Virus has its own share of issues. It alters human and transhuman physiology in unforeseen ways to most of us. It generally manipulates the people it infects. There's one strain that's particularly interesting. It's called the Watts-McLeod strain of the Excercise Virus. And this makes specific changes in the brain architecture. Ostensibly, that's all it does, is it changes brain architecture. But what these changes to the brain architecture do is they put these people into a state where they can do things with their brain. These things amount to various psionic abilities. And these people are called asyncs. And there are various substrains of the Watts-McLeod strain of the Excercise Virus. Each of these substrains has its own sort of specialties in what it does. The architect, for instance, is known for its curiosity and its tendency to build and do long-term planning. And when you're playing an async, you have to think of your virus, your infection, as a separate entity. It wants something. It has goals, even if they are distant, even if it doesn't directly impact you. As it gets stronger, it becomes a sort of whispering voice, suggesting things for you to do. But at the same time, you get certain abilities from this. These might be reading minds. These might be moving objects with your mind. Either way, it's these sorts of things that are what psionics is in Eclipse Phase. A big mess of trouble because guess what? You've got another voice in your head telling you what to do, driving you to do things specifically to serve it. This is why the Lost Generation entirely being infected by this strain of the Excercise Virus was a bad thing and led to them at best suffering a large-scale mass schizophrenia. At worst, they suffered large-scale mass schizophrenia. Yeah. And you have to remember, every single member of the Lost Generation was infected with the Watts-McLeod strain of the Excercise Virus. And that's pretty much it for psionics. There's a big debate in Firewall on if asyncs are a threat to humanity or are the best possible weapon for if the Titans return. No one really knows what's going on with them, other than they need to be watched closely either way. And that is the main setting information for Eclipse Phase. These are the main highlights. Next week, I will be talking about the systems and character generation. Until then, I'd like you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.